All right, so now let's talk about isomotic and isotonic. Okay? They're not the same thing. That's not a typo. I know you learned about isometric and isotonic when you dealt with contractions and tonicity in terms of muscle contraction. So there is an isomotic, and it's a totally different creature. Okay? Isotonic and isomotic. Isomotic is the number of particles in a solution, not what the particles are, when we're dealing with two different situations, inside cell and outside the cell. For instance, this is what I kind of teach in AZ too. I draw this. Okay. So here we got two compartments and a semi-membrane membrane that only allows water to go through it. And we have water through here, but at two different levels. Now we can have on one side, this is sodium, and we could have two sodium on one side and one on the other. We could have potassium, one over there and two over there. And we could have chloride. Three over here and one over here. Now this is isomotic because there's 5 on one side and 5 on the other side. We're not looking at what the particles are, we're looking at the number of particles. So we consider this to be isomotic. And that's what a red blood cell is with the surrounding extracellular fluid. It is isomotic because the red blood cell have the equal number of chloride and sodium outside than there is inside. There may be more chloride outside or more sodium outside. When we compare it, it's going to be the same in terms of number. So we consider that isomotic, and that's why we give 0.9% sodium chloride. But we also have isotonic. Now this situation is not isotonic because this is more concentrated than that. This is hypertonic and that is hypotonic. You see it? We're not concerned about what the particles are either in this case. We're looking at the water to particle ratio. And there's more water here than there is here. So there's going to be a fluid movement. There's hypertonic here, hypotonic here. So neither one is isotonic. So when this happens, the water is going to shoot up here, it's going to shoot down here, so that the level's here and here. Now, there's 5 particles here, 5 particles here, but the same number of water molecules is here than there is over here. The water shifted through there. Now there's not going to be any fluid movement. So we now say it's isotonic. And that's why we give sodium 0.9% sodium chloride, because we want to make sure that there's not going to be a shift of fluid from the cells in or out of the cells. Does that make sense?
Well, it can't be both.
It could be. This is isotonic and it's isomotic.
Okay.
Isomotic because there's 5 particles on both sides, and it's isotonic because the fluid movement is not happening anymore.
What do you mean by not?
Meaning they're not the same thing. When people say isotonic, that means the same thing as isomotic. That doesn't mean the same thing.
But they can be.
It can be,
Okay.
yeah, it can happen, but they're not. They don't mean the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the solution here would like to do something about the AID solution to the blood.
That goes into the extracellular fluid, the plasma.
So the wouldn't be isomotic anymore because you can use cells of 0.9, so then it becomes isotonic. So it stays isotonic.
Correct. Right. Okay? All right. So we have types of intravenous fluids, kind of review. We have an isotonic solution. That means the same tonicity as the blood. All right, 0.9% sodium chloride. We could have a hypotonic solution we give. It's less tonicity, so it would be an example is 0.45% that you're giving in. And we could also have something that's going to be a hypertonic solution, and that's a greater tonicity, so we will have something like, let's say, 3%. And a doctor will put down, a nurse practitioner will put down what the percentage they want, but more or less they will give 0.9%, unless there's some kind of situation going on. Okay? So let's do this together. Okay? Michael has recently started working outdoors in the hot weather to earn money for his tuition. After a few days, he experienced headaches, low blood pressure, and a rapid heart rate. His blood sodium was down to 125 milliequivalents per liter. The normal would be about 144 milliequivalents. How do you explain that? Well, keep going. What do you mean dehydration?
Because it's what water is what from this cell, right? Or it's removing the.
What's happening in the hot weather? He's sweating. What is he sweating? Water and salt. If you ever taste your sweat before, it's salty, right? You've done that, I know you have. Right? So it's salty, so you're losing salts too. Does that make sense? So when you lose the salts, then what's going to happen is water is going to shift, right? That means that inside the blood, the blood vessels, it's going to be less concentrated than your cells. Does that make sense? Because we're losing that fluid, or they're losing that salt. So then where does the water want to go? Does it want to go into the cells or into the bloodstream? Into the cells. What happens to the blood volume? Decreases. What happens to the blood pressure? Decrease. Okay? Now, it's going from the extracellular fluid into the intracellular fluid. We also have him going through headaches. Why? Well, you got cerebral spinal fluid, which is an extracellular fluid. Your brain is floating in a bath of fluid. So now it starts sinking down. So when he shakes his head, almost like a hangover, and we'll talk about that when we get there, but when you shake your head, it's going to hit the sides of your skull. Oh, those headaches, right? Because you lost all that water. Does that make sense? And now your heart needs to pump extra hard to try to adapt. Because normally, I'm just giving you numbers, maybe 100 milliliters of blood comes out of the heart, but you got less now. So in order to do that, it's got to pump twice to get that same amount. Maybe only 50 milliliters comes out instead of the 100. So it needs to do 2 contractions together. So your heart rate's going to go faster. Does that make sense? All right? So Michael lost sodium by perspiration. The low sodium in his blood allowed fluid to move into the cells by osmosis. Lack of fluid lowered his blood pressure to give him a headache. The increased heart rate was his body's way of trying to increase blood pressure. Right? Good? Not too bad. That's an NCLEX type question. You got to apply it. So let's do another one. Frank has hypertension, high blood pressure. His doctor has advised Frank to eat a low-salt diet. Frank consumed a lot of salt the day before his last checkup. Blood pressure's up. Why? Yeah.
Because eating the salt lends to the bloodstream.
Good.
So if the water's going to fall into the bloodstream, increase the volume, which will increase the pressure.
Bingo. Right? Does that make sense? Let me just reiterate. So what happens is you eat the salt, it goes into the digestive system, it gets absorbed into your bloodstream. You have salt now that is basically making your plasma in your blood more concentrated. Your body doesn't like that. So fluid is going to leave your cells and go and try to dilute your plasma in your blood. That's going to add water to your blood volume. Your blood volume goes up. And when that goes up, blood pressure goes up. This is why people with high blood pressure, doctors and nurses say you got to be on a 2-gram sodium diet, or a low sodium diet, or no sodium diet. Because we know that sodium is going to absorb more water into your bloodstream and make your blood pressure go up higher. So we knew that, right? We know salt leads to high blood pressure. Taking pathophysiology, you need to know why. How does that work? Because you'll see there's a lot of common concepts that'll follow this and make your life easier when you go back to this. So the extra salt Frank ate made his blood hypertonic. Hypertonic blood will attract fluids from his body cells by osmosis. Comes fun, all right? All right, so let's talk about a few electrolyte imbalances, okay, disturbances. So an unstimulated resting cell, all right? The plasma membrane, we're going to go back to our good old action potential, all right? The plasma membrane is separating the extracellular fluid, the intracellular fluid. There's a charge on the outside, there's a charge on the inside. And when you subtract that, the difference of that is what we call a membrane potential, resting membrane potential. Okay? And for you to understand this, we have to go back to our good old friend, the salty banana. Okay? So, let's go back to this. Okay. Explain what this is if you haven't had it before, but I think I showed it before. A banana is, because we need to know what is inside the cell, what is the most abundant cation. Remember, a cation is a happy cat, so anything with a positive charge. Potassium, like the banana would be, right? So a banana is loaded with potassium. Now keep this in mind, don't forget this. Just because there's a lot of potassium on the inside, don't forget there's potassium on the outside also. Okay? It's just there's more potassium inside than there is outside. It doesn't mean that there's none outside. Okay? The most abundant cation outside the cell is what? Sodium, right? There is sodium on the inside too, but we just have a lot more of it on the outside. And chloride is the most abundant anion outside the cell. So sodium chloride, that's why I said the salty banana. So we have sodium chloride mostly on the outside. We have potassium mostly on the inside. Okay? So when we have this cell, I just need a lot of room. Okay. Okay. We have a cell here. And we have potassium. There's a lot of potassium on the inside of the cell. And there's some potassium on the outside. But there's more inside than there is outside. Make sense? Okay? Now, sodium, there is more sodium on the outside. But there is sodium on the inside also. Okay? Makes sense? Color-coded here? All right, now, you got to go back. This is all review, but let's see if we remember this stuff. There is sodium gates here. And if the sodium gates open, does sodium want to rush into the cell or rush out of the cell? Okay, think of this being inside the cell, all right, this room. And we have more sodium on the outside. So we have 100 students on the outside, and we got 2 students on the inside. If I open that door, the gate, Are the students want to rush inside or do they want to rush outside? There's 100 outside, there's 2 people inside. Where, when you open up the door, where is the rush going to take place? Is it going to go into the cell or out of the cell? Into the cell, right. And that's simple diffusion. It's going to go from a high concentration to a low concentration. The sodium is going to go from outside the cell to the inside of the cell. Simple diffusion. A&P 101. Okay? Now, we also have potassium gates. And when they open, does potassium want to go into the cell or out of the cell? Out. Because it's going to go from a high concentration potassium ions to a low, right? We've got 100 students in here and 2 students on the outside. When those doors open, everybody inside the cell is going to rush to the outside because there's much more space. Does that make sense? Going from a high concentration to a low concentration. So potassium, when those gates open, it's going to rush out. Does that make sense? Now, potassium has a positive charge. Sodium has a positive charge. So, step by step. When sodium gates open, sodium goes into the cell or out of the cell? Into the cell. Does that make the cell inside more positive or more negative? Positive, because sodium has a positive charge. It's going to rush inside. Potassium, is that a positive charge or negative charge? Positive. When potassium gates open, does potassium want to go out of the cell or into? Out. Does that make inside the cell more negative or more positive? Negative. Does that make sense? The only thing you have to memorize is this. The rest is just concepts. If you know what simple diffusion is. That's all you need to know to understand the actual potential. So, this is what an actual potential is. Okay? Sodium gates are going to open. Now, let me show you what's going on here. This is your actual potential. I know you guys did this, so I'm just going to be very brief with this. The resting potential is going to be at negative 70 milliequivalents. So, I'm sorry, millivolts. Millivolts is on this side, time is on this side. So we have negative 70 here, negative 55 here, 0 here. We'll say that this is positive 35. Those are the ones you should know. Okay? So we have a resting potential at negative 70. Sodium channel gates open. What happens to the charge inside? Does it become more positive or more negative? Positive. So it goes up, and it goes up pretty slowly. Once it reaches negative 55, the gates open all the way, very wide, and it shoots all the way up, and it reaches about positive 35. This is what we call what? Depolarization. Becomes more positive. And at the point about positive 35 or so, the sodium channel gates close very fast. Bam! So no more sodium comes in. But another thing happens around the same time. Potassium channel gates, they open. If the potassium channel gates open, potassium rushes out, and inside the cell becomes more positive or more negative? Negative. So it's going to go down. Kind of undershoots too. What is this process called? Repolarization. Until it goes back up to negative 70. And that is an action potential, right? You learn that. That's old stuff. You need to understand this because when we talk about too much potassium outside or too little potassium outside, what does that do to this action potential? So it's a quick up and down. Now, one action potential is not going to do any work. It just doesn't. It's like you plugging in a lamp and you put it in and plug it right out. It's just one jolt of electricity. The light will go whoop, whoop. You've got to keep it there so that jolts of electricity happen one after the other. A brigade, boom, 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 and that'll keep the light on. Frequency that's very high will keep that on, maybe really bright. So an action potential, one action potential does no work. You've got to have a brigade of this that goes on. Okay, does that make sense? And let's say that wire doesn't go to a light, but it goes to a muscle. It goes to another neuron, turns that on, stimulates it. That's why our whole bodies are working on electricity, so to say. All right, so let's talk about sodium and then potassium, and then we're done. All right, sodium. This is the most abundant cation outside the cell, in the extracellular fluid. Okay? Its properties, well, it's going to attract water into the extracellular fluid. The more sodium is out there, more water will go out there. Water follows where there's more concentration of sodium. Okay? You've seen that with, like I just talked about, with high blood pressure. Okay? When there's more salt in the bloodstream, water is going to go where there's more sodium. Okay? It's also going to deal with nerve impulses and muscle contraction, because you need to understand that when we deal with the action potential. Now, hormones. There's a whole slew of different hormones that are going to affect sodium. You need to know about these. All right? This is all going to be reviewed for you guys, so I'm just making it short but sweet here. But we're going to talk about, when we get to endocrinology, what happens if you have too much or too little of these hormones. So you need to know these. Aldosterone. That's going to reabsorb sodium at the kidney level. When sodium gets reabsorbed, water is going to follow, blood pressure will go up. Well, aldosterone makes blood pressure go up by that way. Estrogen is similar in structure of aldosterone, so it has like an aldosteronian effect where it does target somewhat of the kidney, and that will also reabsorb sodium. Okay. Women that are on birth control with a high amount of estrogen, well, yeah, I could tell that you're going to be bloated a little bit. All right, it's just if I see her, I could check that. You know, otherwise there's other things going on. But that's another thing too. Is like you know that, let's say you're going to be on birth control, you're eating normally. Why am I gaining all this weight? Well, it's because it also has more water that's staying in your body. So we do have birth control that also has, like, they mix it with a diuretic so you can pee some of that out. All right, there's certain things on there. But again, that's all over the scope of this course. But that's what happens with that. That's why estrogen does that. It has like an aldosterone kind of effect. We also have cortisol that comes from the adrenal cortex. That'll also reabsorb sodium. All right, it'll also help us counteract stress. ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone, when we have too much sodium in the bloodstream, ADH is going to reabsorb water to try and dilute that sodium that's in the bloodstream. Does that make sense? It doesn't increase sodium, but it's going to affect sodium or be affected by sodium to do certain things. And then this one here, atrial natriuretic peptide, also known as atrial natriuretic hormone, ANP or AMH, that does the opposite of aldosterone. In fact, it targets the adrenal cortex to stop secreting aldosterone. It does the opposite. So it's going to stop sodium reabsorption. Okay? So these all hormones should be old news to you guys, but I'm trying to put it together here when we're talking about sodium. So let's talk about a little bit about if you have too much sodium. Okay? Something we call hypernatremia. Hypernatremia, that's where the Na comes from in sodium. In Latin, I guess it's natria or whichever, but that's what it stands for. So we have hyper, an increased amount of natria, sodium, in the bloodstream, emia. That's what hypernatremia is. When you have this, if you have an increase of sodium, that's going to increase water into extracellular fluid. It's going to bring more water into the bloodstream, which means it's going to increase blood volume, which means your blood pressure will go up and cause hypertension. When it gets too high, then the fluid has no place to go. It starts going into your interstitial area, and you start getting edema. Okay? If your kidneys can't get rid of all that. All right? So that's what happens with that. So you get high blood pressure, hypertension. You get cellular dehydration that we talked about. Water leaves the cells. Muscle twitching, mental confusion, coma, depends on how much. It could cause cerebral edema that I talked about before. There's too much fluid that's going into the brain cells, and they start swelling and getting edematous. We also have hyponatremia, and this is a decrease of sodium in the bloodstream. When that happens, we have a decrease of water in the blood, which means that you're going to decrease blood volume. That would have low blood pressure. That's something we call hypotension. When you have hypotension, your blood pressure is low, you tend to faint, or you just get up and like, whoa, I feel woozy, because your body has to adjust to that low blood pressure. Okay? You get hypotension, as we talked about before, tachycardia. Your heart wants to race. It's rapid because it's trying to compensate because of the low blood pressure to get the blood pressure back up, and you get muscle weakness. All right, so that's hyponatremia versus hypernatremia. So just a few things about edema. We talked about it before, but there's really three general reasons why you would get edema. Okay, general reasons. You can have congestive heart failure, so you increase your venous pressure. When that happens, I showed you with right heart failure that you're going to have buildup of fluid in these inferior and superior vena cava, right? You're going to get pedal edema because all that fluid starts going out. It starts off because your feet are down by the ground. Gravity goes there first, but gradually as it goes up, it starts going into your superior vena cava, and what happens is your jugular vein starts getting distended, and you start seeing an increased pressure over there. When you lean at 45 degrees, you'll see the person's blood pressure, or you see the jugular vein, we call it JVD, jugular venous distension. And you see these veins just being distended because of the amount of blood that's in there. Okay? Another reason, we talked about this, liver disease, right? Liver makes albumin. So if you have liver disease, you're not going to make albumin. If you don't make albumin, there's going to be a problem with the oncotic pressure that will decrease. And when that happens, you're going to have edema. Now, the way this works, because it's the liver being affected, your abdomen gets affected first. And what they do is that the water it gets edematous, but it goes into your cavity of your abdomen. So it starts, so your belly becomes very bloated because there's a lot of fluid in there. And we call that ascites. We'll talk more about that when we get into the GI diseases. We could also have nephrotic syndrome or some sort of kidney disease. If the liver here doesn't make albumin, well, if you have kidney disease, you lose albumin. So the albumin are proteins, and the proteins will go into your urine, and you have proteinuria. You don't want that. You don't want proteins in your urine. So either way, you're going to lose, well, you have a decrease of albumin, whether you have liver disease or kidney disease. What happens here, though, in nephrotic syndrome or kidney disease, you'll have a decreased oncotic pressure, but what happens, it affects the whole body altogether. And we call it anasarca, where your whole body gets edematous. You kind of look like the Michelin Man. If you know what the tire place is, that Michelin guy, that's what it looks like. The whole body becomes very edematous. We call that anasarca. Okay? All right. So let's talk about potassium, and then we'll be done with this. Okay? Potassium, most abundant cation inside the cellular area. It's going to track water into the intracellular fluid. It deals with nerve impulses and muscle contraction. The major hormone here, there's only one to really be concerned about with potassium, and that's going to be aldosterone. Remember how we said aldosterone is going to reabsorb sodium, water is going to follow, right? As sodium goes in, it's going to make the bloodstream more concentrated. So water has to come in to dilute it. The problem is we're making the bloodstream more positive by bringing a sodium. So we have to lose a positive charge. So it's going to reabsorb sodium, but it's going to excrete or secrete potassium. Does that make sense? Okay? So that's where that comes in. So let's talk about the two on here. Hyperkalemia, all right? Hyperkalemia is probably, I think most all the medical professionals have decided that this is probably the most dangerous of all the electrolyte disturbances. Potassium has a very, what we call, small window where it can actually be too low or too high. It has to be between 3.5 to 5.5. And that's a very tight window. If it's 5.7, things are going to go wrong. If it's 3.2, things are going to go wrong. You can see it in the body. So that's why we're very cautious about the levels of the potassium. If the level is 7.2, even if it's a lab error, the doctor will say, we need to get another one. We can't let you go home with a 7.2. It's just too high. All right? So why am I making a big thing about this? Well, if we increase potassium, you're going to decrease the amount of potassium leaving the cells. So let me show you what's going on here. Let me take out all the sodium. Okay, so we can just concentrate on potassium. All right. So normal, all right, so normally that's the way it's supposed to be, right? There's more potassium inside the cell than outside the cell, right? But what if we put more potassium outside the cell? If you put more potassium outside the cell, then, and I'll just show you like this. If we open up potassium gates, does potassium want to go into the cell or out of the cell? Into. That's going to mess up this whole thing, is it not? See the issue? All right? So if you increase potassium on the extracellular fluid, you're going to decrease the potassium leaving the cells, which means the intracellular fluid is going to be more positive, because it's going to have a hard time leaving the cell. You're going to get more of a situation that's going to be like this, depending how severe it is. Does that make sense? All right? So the action potential is going to have a difficult time to repolarize. You won't get a muscle contraction. If this is your cardiac muscle, you're going to have the contraction, but it's still in a sustained contraction. It needs to go back down to -70 to restart the whole thing. It's taken a long time. That person's going to die of cardiac arrest.
Why would it go down if nobody's potassium?
Well, it depends on how severe the hyperkalemia is. You know, I kind of drew it this way. But what if there was, you know, a 5 to 6 ratio? Still going to come out, but a little bit slower. Does that make sense? Also, too, this is what happens, too. The -70 is the resting potential. It has to reach -55 to meet threshold. In other words, if the sodium does not reach, it goes to, let's say, -65, it won't go all the way. The sodium gates open all the way when it reaches -55. It's only open partially over here. It has to reach -55. And for it to actually go through another act potential, it has to go back down to -70. It's in an absolute refractory period. The way I teach it with my AMP1 students is an action potential. Sounds weird, but it's like a toilet bowl. All right, it's not a toilet bowl here in a school or let's say in a store. It's like a toilet bowl in your house. When you flush the toilet, can you flush it again right away? No. Okay. I don't say you don't do this, but I know you do this. all right? It's a physiological thing. We all go to the bathroom. So when you flush the toilet, you can't do it again. Why? Because you have to wait for the water to fill up in the tank for you to flush it again. It's in its own absolute refractory period. It has to wait for it to fill up. It has to wait before it gets to -70 again before you can bring it back up. You can't, in other words, if I stimulated this cell over here at this point here, it's going to do nothing. It doesn't do this and go back up and do another thing. It has to still go back down to -70. You flush the toilet and immediately you want to you're not going to flush the toilet. You have to wait until the tank fills. It's in an absolute refractory period. Does that make sense? Hard to come up with that kind of analogy. Okay? So what happens here is if inside the cell is more positive because the potassium has problems going out, that resting potential is not going to be -70. It's going to be, let's say, -60. Now before, I only had to go up from -70 to -55. I had to go up 15 notches for me to open up those gates all the way. Now, since it's more positive inside in hyperkalemia, because it's a problem potassium leaving the cell, so any potassium that's in there is going to stay there. Now I only have to go up 5. It becomes a little bit more excitatory. So you get that little bump, that little contraction, but it's going to have problems going back down. So that person's heart muscle is going to contract, but it's going to stay in this absolute refractory period. You're going to die of cardiac arrest. It can't make another contraction. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay? So that's what's happening with this. All right? Let me just finish up over here really quick. So you get cardiac arrhythmias, cardiac arrest. Okay? You get some EKG findings on there. Won't spend too much time talking about that. I won't have you memorize that. But if you, some students will go into their medical internships and want to go back to my notes and stuff, and that's what you see if you're doing cardiac or whichever. And muscle weakness. For hypokalemia, the decrease of potassium, you'll get cardiac arrhythmias. Arrhythmias meaning irregular heartbeats. But it doesn't get so severe as cardiac arrest. But you do see some arrhythmias happening. Some EKG changes. They get muscle weakness and cramps. They also get constipation owing to some of the smooth muscle that's around the intestines that's not working properly. If the muscle gets very weak because of hypokalemia, then those muscles, the smooth muscles around the intestines, are not going to squeeze the food and milk it forward. It's going to sit there for a long amount of time. Water will get absorbed. The feces will get harder, like clay, and then you'll get constipated. Does that make sense? Right? So that's where that comes in. All right? And this is just showing you, again, oh, and let me just show you really quickly over here. So I showed you with hyperkalemia. If you have hypokalemia, now let's just draw this in a different way, that the potassium is going to leave faster, right? So you're going to have less potassium out here than usual. So that means this potassium is going to shoot out there a lot faster. So that means that if that's going to happen, what happens to the charge inside the cell? Does it become more negative or more positive? Negative. So what happens is, instead of resting potential being -70, it might go down to, let's say, -80. More negative. Now you got to go up from -80 to -55. So now you got, what, 25 points to go up to? It's not as excitable as what you saw with -60 to -55. So it's not, it becomes less excitable. And that's what it's trying to show in here, is cells are more excitable for hyperkalemia. That the milliequivalent, or millivolts, is much higher. This is normal, so the resting memory potential is kind of like flat over here. In hyperkalemia, that it's more positive. In hypokalemia, cells are less excitable because it's going to be more negative. it takes more, it's less excitable. It's 25 points from the threshold. Whereas hyperkalemia is only 5 points. It's more excitable. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, and this is just EKGs. I could ask you about those, which is FYI.